Havenwood moved at a gentle pace beneath its old trees, each house carrying stories of the past. Among them lived Lucy, a 12-year-old girl who had lost her parents in a fire, leaving only sketches filled with smoke to speak her heart. One stormy night, on a rain-soaked porch, Lucy and her guardian found a weary German shepherd. The dog's eyes met hers, and in that gaze something began. A beginning no one could have expected. What followed would leave the entire town in silence. Watch this moving story unfold. Havenwood rested between rolling hills and quiet forests, a town that carried the weight of history in every wooden porch and brick wall. Streets curved around the old square, where a fountain still spilled water and neighbors greeted each other with slow nods. The town seemed untouched by the rush of distant cities. Life here moved with steady rhythm, guided by season's church bells and the soft glow of lamps at dusk. In this calm town, a 12-year-old girl named Lucy Carter drifted through her days like a shadow. 1 year had passed since the fire that took her parents. The flames had left nothing but ash and silence. And from that night onward, Lucy's voice vanished. She had once been bright and quick to laugh. But now she carried her grief in quiet drawings, filling pages with smoke-twisted beams and blackened skies. Lucy did not speak in class. She did not speak at home. Her classmates whispered about her, some curious, others unkind, yet Lucy remained still, her hands moving only across paper. Teachers tried to reach her, but her silence built a wall too high. The one who took her in was Nolan Donovan, a retired police officer. He had served the town for many years, once close friends with Lucy's father. When the fire ended, the Carter family's life, Nolan stepped forward. He carried his own scars, though they were hidden under a steady face and measured words. The badge he once wore lay in a box on his shelf, but the sense of duty never left him. Nolan's promise to Lucy's father had been clear. If anything ever happens to me, take care of her. And so Nolan did, even if the task felt heavier than anything he had known. Their home life turned into a rhythm of silence. Lucy would sit near the window with her pencils, drawing endless pictures of smoke curling into the sky. Nolan would watch from a distance, unsure how to bridge the space between them. He cooked meals she barely touched, drove her to school where she walked without lifting her eyes, and kept the house in order, as if neat rooms might ease the ache. Yet in that silence, there was something unspoken. Nolan sensed that Lucy's stillness was not empty. It was survival. She carried her grief like a cloak, and until she chose to set it down, no one could lift it for her. Sometimes at night, Nolan would hear the faint scrape of pencil from her room, the rhythm steady against paper. The drawings piled up on her desk, dark clouds, lonely trees, and figures standing on the edge of fire. Each sketch was another echo of what she could not say. The town of Havenwood carried on. Children played in the park, farmers sold produce at the market, and neighbors shared pie recipes over fences. To many, Lucy was just a quiet child passing by. But to Nolan, she was a constant reminder of both duty and loss. He wanted to reach her, yet every attempt felt like speaking across a canyon. The days grew colder as autumn pressed in. Leaves fell in swirls along the narrow streets, and lanterns glowed earlier each evening. Lucy wrapped herself in her silence, walking beside Nolan as though they were two figures cut from different stories. And yet he hoped that someday their paths would join. As the air turned crisp, Nolan guided Lucy up the hill that overlooked Havenwood. There stood a weathered wooden house, its porch creaking in the wind, windows lined with dust yet warm from the fire inside. This was where they lived, now bound together by loss, searching for a way forward. The old house waited with its secrets, its rooms heavy with unspoken words. Within those walls, Nolan's promise and Lucy's silence would find their uneasy balance, two souls dwelling together like fading ghosts. The Donovan house stood like a watchtower over Havenwood, perched on the slope where the trees bent in the wind. Its beams were old oak, darkened by decades of rain. Shingles curved unevenly on the roof, and the porch groaned each time Nolan stepped onto it. Yet inside the hearth still glowed, filling the rooms with a steady warmth that fought against the loneliness clinging to its walls. Lucy wandered through the house as if it were a museum of someone else's life. The photographs of Nolan's years on the police force hung above the mantel, faded badges and medals resting in frames that caught the afternoon light. She passed them without pause, her eyes always drawn to the windows, where shadows stretched long across the hill. The house carried silence in every corner. Nolan fixed breakfast each morning, placing a plate on the wooden table, and Lucy would sit across from him, spooning food with quiet care. They rarely spoke. The clatter of cutlery against porcelain became their conversation, each sound echoing louder than words. At night, Nolan sat in the armchair by the fire, reading the same line of a book over and over, his mind elsewhere. Lucy remained upstairs, bent over her drawings. Their lives moved in parallel, like two streams running close but never touching. Still, Nolan watched her with a sense of duty, heavier than any badge he had ever worn. He remembered the night her father, his closest friend, had gripped his shoulder and said, "If I fall, promise me you will guard her." That promise had lived inside him ever since, carried through the years like a stone in his chest. Now it guided every choice he made. Sometimes when Lucy slept, Nolan stood in her doorway and listened to the faint rhythm of her breathing. It reminded him that she was still here, still fighting through the silence in her own way. He wished he could lift the weight from her, yet he knew the burden was hers to lay down when ready. The house on the hill became both a shelter and a prison. Its walls held them together, yet its rooms magnified the distance between them. They passed each other in the hallway like ghosts, sharing the same corridor, each haunted by memories that could not be spoken aloud. Nolan carried his grief differently. He busied himself with small repairs, hammering nails into loose boards, oiling hinges, and sweeping fallen leaves from the porch. These tasks gave him purpose, but they did little to close the gap with Lucy. Each time he looked at her, he saw not just a child, but the memory of his friend, the weight of a promise, and the ache of a family torn apart by fire. Lucy, in turn, carried her sketchbook wherever she went. She filled it with forests shrouded in mist, lonely figures standing under storm clouds, and houses with windows glowing faintly in the dark. Nolan never asked about the drawings. He understood they were her language, the only way she could share the shape of her world. Autumn deepened. The wind swept harder across the ridge, rattling shutters and carrying the scent of pine down the valley. Nights grew longer, and the old house creaked with the strain of weather pressing against it. Inside, the silence between guardian and child thickened, waiting for something to break it. And then one night, as rain lashed against the roof and thunder rolled through the hills, Nolan paused by the front door. Through the roar of the storm, he heard it. Faint, but clear. A sound that did not belong to the wind. A low, aching whine came from beneath the porch, as if some creature had collapsed there, clinging to the last threads of strength. Nolan reached for the handle, heart steady but alert, unaware that what waited outside would change their lives forever. The storm raged outside, rain striking the windows with sharp fingers, thunder rolling through the hills like a drumbeat. Nolan opened the door and leaned into the wind. The lantern by the porch swung wildly, its light spilling over the wet boards. There in the corner beneath the steps, he saw movement. A shape pressed tight against the wood, trembling. The sound came again, a broken whine, soft, yet filled with pain. Nolan stepped closer, his boots heavy on the soaked planks. The light caught the figure, and he froze. A German shepherd lay curled against the boards, fur matted with mud and rain ribs showing under its skin. Its eyes, dark and tired, lifted toward him with a flicker of desperate trust. The dog tried to rise, but collapsed back down, legs too weak to hold. "Easy," Nolan murmured, though his voice was nearly lost in the roar of the storm. He crouched, extending a hand slowly. The animal did not bare its teeth or retreat. It only shivered, soaked to the bone. Behind him, soft footsteps rushed down the stairs. Lucy appeared at the door, her nightshirt clinging to her small frame, hair tangled from sleep. Her eyes widened at the sight before her. For the first time in a year, her face changed with more than silence. She darted past Nolan, kneeling on the wet boards without hesitation. Her arms wrapped around the dog, pulling it close despite the mud and the rain. The shepherd's head dropped against her shoulder, too tired to resist. Lucy pressed her cheek into its fur, her thin frame shaking, though not from the cold. Nolan stood still, watching the scene unfold. The girl who had lived like a ghost now clung to this broken creature as if they were bound by the same wound. The storm beat down on both of them. Yet in that moment, something inside the silence cracked. Lucy lifted her eyes toward Nolan. They did not speak, but the plea was clear. She wanted this dog saved, wanted it kept safe in the only place she had left to call home. Nolan exhaled steady and long. He reached down, sliding his arms beneath the shepherd's fragile body. The dog gave a faint whimper, but did not fight. Nolan carried the weight inside his shirt, dampened by the animal's wet fur. Lucy followed close, her hand resting lightly on the dog's side. Inside, Nolan laid the shepherd on an old blanket near the fire. The dog curled into the warmth sides, rising and falling in uneven rhythm. Lucy knelt beside it, drying its fur with trembling hands, her face set with fierce determination. For the first time, Nolan saw life return to her eyes. It was not the fire of grief, but a spark of care, a pull towards something beyond her own sorrow. Hours passed as the storm howled outside. Nolan brewed tea and kept watch, yet his gaze often drifted to Lucy. She did not move from the dog's side. When the shepherd stirred, she smoothed its fur. When it whimpered, she leaned closer, as if her presence could steady its heart. The fire burned low, painting their faces in gold. Nolan sat back in his chair, studying the fragile bond forming before him. Perhaps this was the moment that would change the shape of their silence. The shepherd shifted again, pressing its nose against Lucy's palm. She smiled faintly, an expression Nolan had not seen in a long time. She picked up her sketchbook, tore out a blank page, and traced a single word in bold letters. She held it up for Nolan to see. Tomorrow she would write that same word on a bowl. A name clear and strong that would belong to the dog who had stumbled into their storm. Morning light filtered through the old windows, soft and pale after the night's storm. The house smelled faintly of smoke from the fire and damp earth carried in by the dog's fur. Nolan rose, early joints stiff, and found Lucy already awake. She sat cross-legged on the floor beside the shepherd, who still slept, chest rising in slow, steady rhythm. On the table sat a simple ceramic bowl. Across its side, in uneven but determined letters, Lucy had written one word: Brody. Nolan paused in the doorway, surprised. For months her world had been drawn only in shadows, smoke, fire, and dark lines etched on paper. Now for the first time she had chosen letters. A name. Brody, he repeated softly, testing the sound in the quiet room. The dog stirred, lifting its head as if it already understood. Lucy reached forward, sliding the bowl across the floor until it rested near the shepherd's paws. Brody sniffed tail, giving the faintest thump against the blanket. Nolan felt something shift inside him. The girl who had refused every word now placed one before him, not spoken but written clear enough to carry meaning. It was more than a name. It was a sign of her reaching out, however carefully, toward life again. He moved closer, crouching beside her. "That's a good name," he said. "Strong." Lucy did not meet his eyes, but she pressed her hand gently into the dog's fur. The German shepherd leaned into her touch as if to seal the bond. The rest of the morning unfolded quietly. Nolan prepared oatmeal, and set a portion for Lucy, while Brody ate from the bowl with a hunger that came from days of neglect. Lucy watched every bite, her thin shoulders relaxing with each mouthful the dog swallowed. When Brody finished, he padded unsteadily to the hearth and curled back onto the blanket. Lucy opened her sketchbook again. Nolan expected the usual heavy strokes of black and gray, but when he passed behind her, he noticed something different. The lines still curved in shadows, but this time there was shape, a dog standing tall beside a small figure. The shift was subtle, yet profound. For months, she had drawn loss. Now she was drawing presence. Through the afternoon, Brody followed Lucy as far as his strength allowed. From room to room, he shadowed her steps, resting only when she sat down. Nolan patched a spot on the porch roof, listening to the faint rhythm of her feet above and the soft scrape of the dog's claws across the floorboards. At dusk, Nolan brought wood to the fire. He found Lucy seated on the rug, Brody's head in her lap. She was humming. Not words, only a tune broken and fragile, like the first crack of sunlight after a long night. Nolan's chest tightened at the sound. It was not her voice, not yet, but it was closer than silence. He did not comment. He only stirred the fire, letting its glow deepen the peace of the room. Later, as the house grew quiet again, Brody rose and walked to the foot of the stairs. He lay down across the threshold, his body a barrier between Lucy's room and the rest of the world. The message was unmistakable. He had chosen his place as her guard. Nolan stood in the hall for a long moment, watching the dog's steady form. The house no longer felt quite so empty. In Brody's breathing, in Lucy's softened gaze, there was the beginning of something new. He whispered to himself, half prayer and half promise. Maybe this is the start. Upstairs, Lucy's lamp burned late. When Nolan peeked in, he saw her bent over her sketchbook, no longer only smoke and ruin. This time, the page carried the outline of trees, a rising sun. And beside the girl in her drawing, the unmistakable shadow of a dog. The silence of the house was different now. It carried hope, faint but steady. Nolan left her to her work, closing the door gently behind him. Tomorrow would bring its own weight. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, the old house on the hill felt alive. Morning broke with pale sunlight spreading across the ridge. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and sharp, the sky washed bright. Nolan brewed coffee while Lucy sat at the table, sketchbook open, pencil moving in quiet rhythm. He glanced over her shoulder, expecting smoke-filled scenes. Yet what he saw stopped him, a horizon traced in gentle lines. Trees rising tall, and in the corner the shadow of a dog with ears lifted, standing guard. Nolan set his mug down softly. It was not just a drawing. It was proof of change, a whisper of something lighter stirring in her heart. He wanted to tell her he noticed, but he held back. Too much praise might close her again. Instead, he nodded once, a quiet sign that he understood. Brody padded across the room, his paws clicking softly on the worn wood floor. He rested his head against Lucy's knee, and she smiled faintly. That small curve of her lips carried more warmth than the sun streaming through the windows. Days settled into rhythm. Lucy fed Brody each morning, setting down the bowl with his name painted across its side. The dog ate eagerly, then followed her everywhere, up the stairs, across the yard, into the corner where she liked to draw. At night, he stretched out before her bedroom door, his steady presence turning fear into safety. The nightmares still came. Nolan heard the muffled cries in the dark, but each time, before he could reach her, Brody was already there, pressing his body against the bed, anchoring her trembling hands with his fur. The storm in her sleep eased faster now, her breathing steadied sooner. In the morning, she looked less haunted, her eyes clearer, as if the dog had guarded not only her door, but her dreams. Nolan noticed other changes too. Her drawings filled with light. A sunrise breaking across hills, branches full of green leaves, even faces, tentative, unfinished, but no longer hidden in shadow. And always beside the girl in the sketches, the figure of a German shepherd. Each stroke told Nolan something he could not put into words. Lucy was beginning to live again. Sometimes in the quiet evenings he caught himself listening, not for silence, but for sound. The scrape of pencil, the shuffle of Brody's paws, even the soft hum Lucy had started to make when she thought no one heard. They were small things, yet each carried a promise that her voice might one day return. One afternoon, Nolan sat on the porch, mending a broken railing. Lucy and Brody played in the yard below. She tossed a pine cone, and though Brody's limp made him slower, he bounded after it tail high. Lucy laughed. A breath of sound, quick and fleeting, but real. Nolan froze, hammer still in his hand. It was only a laugh, only a spark. But to him, it was as if the whole hill had lit up. He leaned back against the railing, letting the moment settle deep inside him. For months, silence had been their constant companion, heavy and cold. Now, with a dog stretched across their threshold and a child finding her light in sketches and soft sounds, the silence had begun to shift. That night, as Nolan checked the locks, he passed by Lucy's door. Brody lay across the threshold as always, ears alert, eyes half closed. Nolan whispered to him, "Keep watching, old boy. You're doing more than I ever could." Brody's tail thumped once in reply. Inside the room, Lucy's lamp glowed faintly. She was drawing again, and Nolan knew without looking that there would be a sunrise on the page. He carried that image with him as he turned off the lights downstairs. For the first time in a long while, hope did not feel like a distant dream. It lived in the house, in the steady breath of Ibo, and in the quiet strength of a girl who was learning to step out of the shadows. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. School children who did not understand her silence, and a boy who carried cruelty in his voice. But tonight, Havenwood slept in peace, and the old house on the hill kept its light. The morning air would carry the scent of pine and damp earth as Nolan walked Lucy to school. Brody padded at her side, his red support vest snug across his back. The dog's steady presence seemed to steady Lucy too. She clutched her sketchbook close, her eyes fixed on the ground, her steps small but sure. The schoolyard buzzed with voices. Children chasing each other across the grass, backpacks slung loosely, laughter ringing sharp against the autumn sky. But when Lucy entered the yard, the sound shifted. Some children fell quiet, others whispered. She was the girl who never spoke, the girl who had lost everything in fire. Their stares pressed against her like cold rain. Brody walked close, his body brushing her leg, anchoring her in the swirl of noise. Nolan squeezed her shoulder gently before letting her go at the steps. "You've got this, Lucy," he said. She didn't reply, but her hand lingered in Brody's fur a moment longer, drawing courage from the warmth there. Inside the classroom, desks lined in neat rows, sunlight spilling through tall windows. Lucy took her seat near the back, Brody lying at her feet. Her classmates stole glances, some curious, some wary. The teacher cleared her throat, reminded them of respect, and began the lesson. Yet beneath the surface, unease remained. It did not take long for trouble to find her. Cameron Ward leaned across the aisle, a smirk tugging at his lips. His father, Calvin Ward, was a man of weight in town, and Cameron carried that same sense of untouchable confidence. "Hey, ghost girl," he muttered, just loud enough for those around him to hear. "Need your mutt to do the talking for you." Snickers rose from the boys beside him. Lucy's grip on her pencil tightened. She bent her head, sketching a quick line on her page, as if she could disappear into the drawing. Brody lifted his head, ears pricking, eyes fixed on Cameron. The boy's grin faltered for a moment under the shepherd's steady gaze. But pride stiffened his shoulders. He flicked a paper ball toward Lucy's desk. Brody growled low, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The teacher glanced up, frowning, but Lucy placed a calming hand on Brody's back. The dog settled, though his eyes never left Cameron. At lunch, Lucy sat at the edge of the cafeteria, sketchbook open. She drew in silence while Brody rested against her chair. Around her, groups of children gathered in clusters, swapping snacks and chatter. Few came near. She was still an island, though not alone anymore. Cameron noticed. He leaned against the table across the room, arms crossed, watching her. The way she leaned toward the dog, the faint smile that sometimes touched her lips when she traced his shadow on paper. It stirred something sharp in him. Resentment. Why should she, the silent girl, get attention, even if from a dog? Later, as recess rang out, Lucy sat beneath an oak tree, Brody sprawled beside her. The air was filled with shouts from children playing tag, but Lucy's world was narrowed to pencil and page. She sketched the outline of the oak, its roots curling deep. Brody's shape nestled at its base. Cameron passed by with his friends, their laughter sharp. "Look at her," he sneered, "drawing dogs because she can't say a word." One of the boys laughed too loudly, earning a warning look from a teacher nearby. Lucy's cheeks flushed, her pencil pressing harder into the page. Brody shifted, rising to sit tall beside her, his eyes steady on the group. Cameron muttered something under his breath and walked on, but his gaze lingered. The dog had unsettled him, and the girl's silence no longer seemed weak. It felt like defiance. When the bell rang and children streamed back inside, Nolan was waiting near the gate. Lucy came slowly, Brody pressed against her side. Nolan noticed the way her shoulders slumped. Her eyes shadowed despite the clear sky. He opened his mouth to ask, but stopped when he saw her hand slide along Brody's back, drawing comfort in silence. Driving home, Nolan glanced in the mirror at the two of them in the back seat. Lucy with her sketchbook, Brody with his head in her lap. Together they looked steady, but Nolan's chest tightened with unease. There had been something in the boy's eyes, Cameron Ward. Something more than cruelty for sport. It was calculation, the kind that left bruises deeper than fists. The morning after a long week, Nolan knelt to check Brody's fur before Lucy left for school. His hand paused behind the shepherd's ear. Beneath the thick coat, a patch of skin was raw, the hair rubbed thin. Brody twitched, but did not pull away. Nolan's jaw tightened. It was no accident. He thought of Cameron Ward's sharp eyes, the way the boy had looked at Lucy at the dog. A seed of worry rooted deeper in his chest. He dabbed a cloth with ointment, speaking low as he worked. "Who did this to you, boy?" Brody sat still, calm and steady, as though used to being hurt and waiting for care. Lucy appeared at the doorway, sketchbook clutched in her arms. She noticed the cloth, the faint mark on Brody's ear. Her eyes darkened. Without a word, she opened her book to a new page and began to draw. By the time the truck rolled up to Havenwood School, the paper carried the image of a great shadow looming over Brody. The dog, crouched beneath teeth bared not in anger, but in defense. Around the figure, Lucy's pencil marks pressed heavy and dark, as if her fear itself had seeped into the page. Nolan saw it when she slid the sketchbook onto her lap in the back seat. He said nothing, but the drawing chilled him. She had seen the threat more clearly than he had. At school, Lucy's silence wrapped tighter. She moved through the halls like a ghost. Brody padded beside her, the click of his nails steady against the polished floor. Children parted for them, but not always kindly. Whispers chased her steps, some mocking, some wary. In the cafeteria, Cameron leaned against a table, his friends around him. His gaze followed Lucy as she sat alone at the edge, Brody resting at her feet. He smirked, nudged one of the boys, and muttered something that made them laugh. Lucy lowered her eyes to her book drawing again. This time, her pencil carved harsher lines. Brody standing in front of her, the shadow figure lunging forward, claws stretched. Nolan's warning voice echoed in her mind. Silence doesn't always keep you safe. But she wasn't ready to break it yet. Not in front of Cameron. Later on the playground, the danger sharpened. Lucy stood near the oak tree, Brody pressed close against her leg. Cameron passed by slowly, his words soft so teachers would not hear. Your mutt won't always be around to save you. One day, it'll be just you. His smile carried no humor, only promise. Lucy froze her hand buried in Brody's fur. The dog's body stiffened ears high, a low rumble in his chest. Cameron stepped back, but his eyes lingered, glinting with challenge. He wanted her afraid. That night, Nolan sat at the kitchen table, Brody lying at his feet. Lucy spread her drawings across the wood surface, each one darker than the last. In every sketch, shadows clawed at Brody, pressed against him, tried to drag him away. And always, she was there behind him, small, voiceless, waiting. Nolan picked up one of the pages, his throat tight. He's protecting you, he said softly. Lucy nodded, her eyes fixed on the image. She flipped to another drawing. This time, Brody's body bore scratches, and in the corner, a figure of a boy stood half hidden in dark strokes. Cameron's outline was clear, even without his name. Nolan looked at her, the question in his eyes. Lucy closed the sketchbook with a sharp snap. She was not ready to say it out loud, but her silence carried the truth. Cameron had crossed a line, and it was only a matter of time before he struck again. Upstairs, as Brody settled outside her room, Lucy stared at her sketchbook on the desk. She opened it once more and began a new drawing. Not just of shadows, but of herself holding something small, square, and bright. A camera. The thought had taken root. The next morning, Lucy tucked her sketchbook into her backpack, as always. But inside, hidden between two pages, she had slipped something new. A small disposable camera Nolan had given her months ago for an art project. He had forgotten about it, but Lucy had not. Today, it had a purpose. At school, she walked with Brody close at her side, his vest snug, his stride steady, despite a faint limp. Cameron's eyes followed them as they crossed the yard. His smirk told her he was not done. During recess, Lucy sat beneath the oak tree, sketchbook open on her lap, pencil moving in slow strokes. But her other hand hovered inside her backpack, fingers curled around the cool shape of the camera. Cameron passed again, his friends trailing behind. One of them muttered something about the mute girl and her guard dog. Cameron stepped closer, glancing around for teachers. He tossed a pebble that struck Brody's flank. The shepherd flinched, but stayed at Lucy's side, eyes trained on the boy. Lucy's pulse thudded in her ears. She raised the camera just slightly, pretending to adjust her sketchbook. The click of the shutter was nearly drowned by the noise of the playground. Cameron didn't notice. Later, near the swings, he tried again. A quick shove of his shoe against Brody's paw. The dog whimpered, pulling back. Lucy's hand shook, but she pressed the shutter again. Another picture captured another piece of proof. Each time Cameron sneered, each time his foot lashed out, Lucy lifted the lens. Quiet, careful, invisible. By the time the bell rang, the camera held more than sketches ever could. That afternoon, she sat at her desk at home, the camera hidden under her pillow. She stared at her drawings, the shadows she had traced again and again. Now she had more than shadows. She had evidence. Still, the thought of showing Nolan, or anyone, made her chest tighten. She imagined Nolan's face, the anger he would try to hide, the storm in his voice when he spoke to Cameron's father. She imagined the whispers at school if the truth came out, the eyes on her, the weight of everyone's judgment. She turned to a blank page in her sketchbook. With careful strokes, she drew herself standing tall, camera in hand, Brody beside her. But the lines trembled. The figure of Cameron loomed larger than her pencil could capture. She snapped the book shut, unable to finish. That night, Nolan noticed her restlessness. She picked at her dinner, her eyes sliding off into Brody, who lay across her feet beneath the table. Nolan leaned back in his chair, studying her. He sensed something building, something she was carrying alone. "You've been drawing more," he said gently. Lucy kept her head down. He reached across the table, touching her sketchbook. "Whatever it is, you don't have to face it by yourself." Her throat ached. Words pressed inside her, but they stopped short like birds trapped behind glass. She shook her head, retreating into silence. Brody lifted his head, pressing his muzzle against her hand. The dog's eyes were steady, as if urging her forward. She stroked his fur, taking comfort in the warmth, but her secret stayed locked behind her ribs. Later in her room, Lucy slid the camera into the pages of her sketchbook. She wrote one word on the cover in bold strokes: proof. Then she tucked it into her drawer. Not yet, she told herself. She would face it, but not yet. Downstairs, Nolan sipped his coffee, staring into the fire. Something was coming. He felt it in the weight of the silence and the shadows that seemed to cling to Brody's steady form. He could not name it, but he knew it was near. And when the town gathered soon for Havenwood's Memorial Festival with bright banners and old uniforms with laughter and undercurrents of rivalry, the truth Lucy carried would press even harder against her silence. Havenwood woke early for the Memorial Festival. The town square filled with color. Red, white, and blue banners stretched across storefronts, stalls lined the sidewalks, and the smell of roasted corn drifted on the crisp air. Children darted between booths with painted flags on their cheeks, while church bells rang out in steady rhythm. For most, it was a day of joy and memory, a time to honor the fallen and to gather as one community. For Nolan, it carried a heavier weight. He pulled his old uniform from the closet, brushing dust from the shoulders. The fabric still held the shape of service, the reminder of a life he had once known. When he buttoned it, the mirror reflected not just the man he was, but the man he had promised to be. The one who would protect Lucy. Lucy watched him from the stairs, her sketchbook tucked under one arm, Brody's leash in her hand. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair brushed carefully, a ribbon tied at the back. She did not speak, but her eyes held quiet determination. Brody stood close, ears high, vest snug across his back. He seemed to sense the importance of the day. The walk into town was steady. People greeted Nolan with nods of respect, their eyes lingering on the old uniform. Some reached out to pat Brody, and Lucy's lips curved faintly at their kindness. Yet she stayed close to Nolan, her hand never leaving the dog's fur. The ceremony began at noon. Veterans lined the steps of the courthouse, names of the fallen read aloud in solemn cadence. Nolan stood among them, shoulders squared, medals glinting in the sun. Lucy stood at the edge, Brody pressed against her leg. She traced each word in her mind, letting the rhythm of memory steady her. After the speeches, the mood shifted. Music swelled from the bandstand, and the festival took on its lighter spirit. Children tugged parents toward rides, merchants called out their wares, and laughter returned to the air. Lucy wandered with Brody through the stalls, Nolan following a step behind. She bought a small cup of lemonade, offered Brody a sip of cool water, and sketched quick outlines of the Ferris wheel turning above the square. For a time, it felt almost normal. Then the Wards arrived. Cameron's father, Calvin Ward, moved through the crowd with his usual air of command. Handshake's firm smile practiced for every camera. Cameron walked at his side, his tie loose, his gaze sharp and restless. The family's presence sent a ripple through the square. Some greeted them eagerly, others looked away. Lucy felt Brody stiffen before she even saw them. His body angled slightly in front of her, his tail low, his attention fixed. She followed his gaze and saw Cameron staring straight at her. His lips curled, not in greeting, but in recognition. Nolan noticed too. His eyes narrowed, his hand settling on Lucy's shoulder. "Stay close," he murmured. The rest of the town carried on. Music games, voices rising. But between Lucy and the wards hung a silent tension. Cameron broke eye contact only when his father steered him toward the mayor's booth. Yet even as they moved, Lucy felt his attention linger, a shadow stretching across the brightness of the day. She clutched her sketchbook tighter. Inside, hidden between pages of drawings, the camera waited. Proof she had not yet dared to share. Her stomach knotted with the weight of it, but her hand found Brody's ear, and he leaned into her touch. His steady presence anchored her against the storm she knew was coming. The festival wound on. Pie contests, brass music, fireworks promised at dusk. But beneath the celebration, Nolan's eyes scanned constantly. He knew what Lucy knew. The wards would not let this day pass quietly. The afternoon sun hung low, painting the square in gold as the festival reached its peak. The brass band struck up a lively tune, children clutched balloons, and the scent of cinnamon sugar drifted from the food stalls. Lucy walked with Brody at her side, Nolan close behind, weaving through the crowd. For a fleeting moment, it almost felt safe. Then Cameron appeared. He broke from a knot of boys near the ring toss booth, his face tight with something harsher than mischief. His gaze locked on Lucy, then dropped to Brody. The shepherd's ears tipped forward, his body shifting protectively. Lucy froze. It happened so quickly that later, Nolan would struggle to recall the exact order. One heartbeat, Brody stood steady at Lucy's side. The next, Cameron's foot lashed out, connecting hard with the dog's ribs. The crack of impact cut through the music. Brody yelped, stumbling, his body curling against the pain. Lucy's world split open. The sketchbook fell from her hands, scattering pages across the pavement. For a year she had carried silence like armor words, buried deep beneath grief. But now, as Brody staggered, the dam broke. Her voice rose sharp and raw, tearing the air. "Don't you ever touch him again." The crowd froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the carousel seemed to stutter in its rhythm. People turned, faces shocked, eyes wide. They had not heard Lucy Carter speak since the fire that had stolen her parents. Now her voice carried across the festival like a bell rung too long in silence. Brody pressed close against her legs, trembling, but standing, his eyes fixed on Cameron. Lucy's small hands clutched his fur, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Her words still hung in the air, fierce and defiant. Nolan surged forward, his hand steadying Lucy's shoulder, his other reaching toward Brody to check his side. The shepherd's ribs rose and fell in quick rhythm. But he held his ground, refusing to lash out. Cameron froze under the weight of every eye in the square. His smirk faltered. Around him, murmurs began. Someone shouted, "I saw it!" He kicked the dog. Another voice rose. She spoke. "Did you hear her?" She spoke. Phones lifted, screens glowed. The moment captured, recorded, replayed before it had even ended. Lucy straightened her hand, never leaving Brody's fur. Her face flushed, her eyes burning with something fiercer than tears. "He's mine," she cried, her voice cracking but strong. "He protects me, and I will protect him." The square held its breath. Even Calvin Ward, standing near the mayor, looked momentarily undone, his polished smile faltering as he realized the crowd had turned. Nolan guided Lucy a step back, placing himself between her and Cameron. His voice was low, dangerous. "That's enough." Cameron's face flushed crimson. He looked to his father, but Calvin was already pulling him back, muttering words lost in the rising noise. People were whispering, pointing, recording. The story was no longer theirs to control. Lucy knelt beside Brody, her hands trembling as she checked him. He licked her wrist, as if to say he was still standing. Tears blurred her vision, but she pressed her forehead against his fur. "You're safe," she whispered, voice breaking. I'll keep you safe. Above them, the crowd began to stir again, though the festival's brightness had fractured. Phones stayed raised, capturing every angle, every word. Nolan knew the footage would not stay in Havenwood. By nightfall, it would be everywhere. He looked at Lucy, her face pale. Her voice newly found her dog pressed close, and felt both pride and fear. She had spoken at last, but the cost would ripple far beyond this square. The band tried to play again, but the music rang hollow. The day was no longer about pie contests or carnival rides. It was about a girl, a tautog and a truth shouted into the world. By nightfall, the square's whispers had grown into something larger. The videos taken at the festival spread from phone to phone, then onto social media, shared with captions that carried both awe and outrage. A single clip, Lucy shouting as she clutched Brody, was viewed thousands of times before the sun had even set. "Don't you ever touch him again." Her voice rang clear in every replay, startling in its force, raw in its truth. By morning, Havenwood was split. At Mason's grocery, customers argued in hushed tones by the produce aisle. That poor girl, after all. She's been through, one woman said, shaking her head. It's about time the wards were held accountable. Across the street at the diner, others muttered differently. It was just a dog, a man insisted. Boys' roughhouse. And Calvin Ward's done more for this town than anyone else. The waitress set down his coffee without a word, her eyes cold. The school corridors carried the same tension. Some children whispered with wonder. She spoke. Did you hear her? Others repeated their parents' doubts, glancing at Lucy with sidelong eyes. For the first time, her silence was no longer her most noticeable trait. It was her voice. Nolan saw the shift everywhere. Strangers stopped him on the street, patting his shoulder, praising Lucy's courage. Others crossed to the opposite sidewalk, unwilling to meet his gaze. The Ward family's shadow stretched long, and many still bent beneath it. At home, the atmosphere trembled with change. Lucy spent hours paging through her sketchbook, Brody's head on her lap, the camera hidden still within its pages. She seemed both lighter and more burdened, relieved to have spoken, yet restless with the weight of what remained unsaid. Nolan brewed coffee late one night, staring into the fire. The town he had known for decades felt different now, unsettled. It's starting, he murmured more to himself than to Lucy. She sat nearby, sketching Brody beneath tall trees, her pencil moving in quiet rhythm. She didn't ask what he meant. Maybe she already knew. In the following days, the ripple spread wider. Regional papers carried the story, "Silent Girl Defends Dog at Memorial Festival." Television crews parked near Havenwood's courthouse, their cameras eager for angles. Some townsfolk welcomed the attention. Others resented it, muttering that outsiders had no place stirring trouble. Through it all, Lucy stayed mostly quiet. Her words measured her hand, always on Brody. But something inside her had shifted. The silence that once shielded her now felt like a cage she was learning to push open. At the hardware store, James, an old friend of Nolan's, leaned close as he bagged nails. "You know, this isn't just about a dog anymore," he said. "The Wards built their power on fear and silence. Your girl just broke both." Nolan nodded, his jaw tight. He had felt it in the way people watched them, in the way Calvin Ward's polished smile had cracked at the festival. Something was unraveling, and they were standing at the center. That night, Lucy pulled the camera from her drawer. She placed it on the kitchen table in front of Nolan, her eyes steady, though her hands trembled. She tapped the word written on her sketchbook cover. Proof. Nolan studied the small device, then lifted his gaze to hers. In her eyes, he saw the same determination he had once seen in her father's, the courage to face what needed facing, even when fear clawed close. The next morning, a letter from the school arrived. An urgent meeting had been called in the principal's office. Calvin Ward would be there. So would Nolan, Lucy, and Brody. Lucy slid the camera into her bag without a word. She was ready to carry her truth into that room. The air in the school hallway was heavy that morning. Teachers guided children past with forced smiles, but their eyes darted toward the principal's office door. Inside, the walls seemed closer than usual, the smell of chalk and old carpet thick. Principal Hensley sat behind her desk, hands folded, her expression measured. To one side, Calvin Ward occupied a chair as though it belonged to him, his suit pressed sharp, his smile tight. Cameron slouched beside him, his jaw-set eyes avoiding everyone. Across the room, Nolan entered with Lucy and Brody. The shepherd walked in first, settling at Lucy's feet, his body low but alert. Nolan gave a polite nod to the principal, but his gaze never left Calvin. "Thank you all for coming." Hensley began, her tone brisk. "We are here to address the incident at the festival and the concerns raised afterward." Calvin leaned forward smoothly. "With respect, Principal, this matter has gone too far. My son is being vilified in front of the entire town based on dramatics from a traumatized child. A child who until recently had not spoken a word in a year." Nolan's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Lucy rose. The chair legs scraped against the floor, startling in the quiet. Her voice, though soft at first, cut through the air. "I have proof." Calvin's smile flickered. He opened his mouth, but Lucy pulled her sketchbook from her bag. Nestled inside was the small disposable camera. She placed it on the desk, her hands steady now. "I took pictures," she said louder this time. Her words carried weight, each one pressed hard with resolve. "Cameron hurt Brody. More than once. And I saved it." The principal glanced at Nolan, then at Calvin. Nolan gave a slight nod, urging Lucy on. She flipped open the sketchbook, sliding out the developed photos she had hidden. Grainy but clear. Cameron tossing stones, shoving a foot against Brody's paw, laughing while the dog recoiled. The room fell silent. Even Principal Hensley's composure cracked as she lifted one photo closer to her glasses. "These are," she began, voice low. "Fabrications," Calvin snapped. "Childish tricks. We will not sit here and—" Lucy's voice rose sharper than he expected. "It's real." Her eyes met his for the first time, steady and unflinching. "I was silent because silence kept me safe. But silence is not weakness. It was survival." She stepped closer to the desk, her hand resting on Brody's head. Her next words rang like iron. "But now I will speak." Even Cameron shifted at that, his posture shrinking under the weight of her declaration. Nolan felt a swell of pride rise in his chest, tempered by the fire in his gaze fixed on Calvin. Principal Hensley gathered herself, her voice firm. "These photos cannot be ignored. Mr. Ward, your son's behavior will face review by the board." As for Abigail Carter, she acted with courage to bring this forward. "Unbelievable," Calvin muttered. But his eyes betrayed something else. Fear, or perhaps recognition, that his grip on the town was loosening. Lucy gathered her photos, sliding them back into her sketchbook. She did not tremble. She did not retreat. Her silence had broken, and there was no returning. Outside, as they walked to the truck, Nolan placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it, kiddo. You faced him." Lucy looked up, her face pale but certain. "There's more," she whispered. Nolan paused. "More?" Her eyes filled with something deeper than fear. "The night of the fire, I saw a car. It had the Ward Company logo." Nolan felt the ground shift beneath him. This was no longer about bullying or a dog or even silence. This reached back to the night that had stolen everything. Brody pressed close to Lucy's side, his eyes scanning the lot as though he too knew they had stepped into something darker. The drive home from the school was quiet, though the silence no longer felt like it once had. It carried weight now, not emptiness. Lucy sat in the passenger seat, her sketchbook resting on her knees, Brody's head leaning against her arm. Nolan's hands gripped the wheel tight, his mind turning over her words again and again. A car with the Ward Company logo. The night of the fire. When they reached the house on the hill, Nolan set his cap on the counter and crouched beside Lucy. "Kiddo," he said gently, "I need you to tell me everything you remember." Lucy opened her sketchbook to a page she had drawn long ago. Dark smoke rose from a house in flames, but in the corner, a car sat beneath the shadows. She traced the logo with her fingertip. Lines, sharp, familiar, undeniable. "I was at the window," she whispered. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. "I couldn't sleep. I saw the car parked near the trees. Then, I saw a man get out. He carried something. I think it was a can. He went behind the house." Her hand trembled as she sketched quick strokes onto the page, recreating the moment. Then the fire started. Nolan's throat tightened. He reached across the table, covering her small hand with his own. "You've been carrying this all alone." Lucy nodded, tears burning her eyes. "Mom told me not to tell. She said it wasn't safe. She said to stay quiet until the right time." Her voice broke. "I thought silence would keep me alive." Brody nudged her hand, his amber eyes steady, grounding her back to the present. Nolan drew a long breath. It was the right time today. And now it's my turn to carry this with you. That evening, Nolan called Sheriff Marcus Reed, a man he had served beside years ago. Within an hour, Marcus arrived at the farmhouse, his cruiser crunching over the gravel drive. The sheriff stepped inside, his presence steady, his eyes sharp. Nolan poured coffee while Lucy sat close to Brody, her sketchbook on the table. Marcus flipped through the pages carefully, his expression hardening when he reached the drawing of the Ward Company car. "Lucy," Marcus said softly, "what you saw is important. It could change everything. But it also means Calvin Ward will fight harder to keep this buried." Lucy looked at him with quiet strength. "I don't want it buried anymore." Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. "We'll reopen the file on the fire. There were suspicions back then, but nothing solid. If she's telling us the truth, and I believe she is, we've got reason to dig deeper." "Where do we start?" Nolan asked. Marcus tapped the drawing. "With the car. If we can connect it to Ward's company, we've got a trail. And Nolan, we'll need you and Lucy to be careful. Ward has influence. He won't go down easy." The plan began to take shape. Marcus would pull old reports, track down witnesses, and check financial records. Nolan would keep watch over Lucy and gather what details she remembered, no matter how small. When the sheriff left, the night settled heavy over the farmhouse. Nolan stood at the window, staring into the dark ridge beyond the trees. Lucy slept upstairs. Brody stretched across her door like a soldier on guard. Nolan whispered into the silence, "We'll get to the truth. For her. For her parents." Down the hall, Brody's ears twitched as if in answer, his body steady against the floorboards. Nolan watched the dog for a long moment. There was something in the shepherd's discipline, the way he carried himself, that reminded Nolan of old comrades. Brody was more than a stray. He had the bearing of one who had already served. The days after Lucy's revelation moved slowly, filled with waiting and watching. Nolan kept to his routines, but his mind remained restless. Each time he studied Brody, how the dog moved, how he reacted, Nolan's suspicions deepened. One afternoon, while Lucy sat on the porch sketching, Nolan tossed a stick toward the yard. He expected Brody to fetch it like any other dog. Instead, the shepherd ignored the stick and snapped his head toward a sound in the distance, a faint hum of an engine rolling down the road. His body stiffened, ears, sharp eyes scanning the horizon like a sentry. "That's not stray behavior," Nolan muttered. Later that evening, Nolan tested him again. He set his old police flashlight on the table, twisting it to cast a narrow beam across the floor. Brody immediately lowered into a crouch, his nose close to the ground, tail rigid as if tracking a target. Nolan froze. It was the exact stance he had seen from trained canines during his years on the force. Nolan dug into a box in the attic, searching through his old contacts. He found a phone number for an acquaintance who had once worked with military dogs overseas. The man answered gruff but curious. When Nolan described Brody's scars, his discipline, his behavior, the man grew quiet. "Sounds like you've got yourself a retired working dog," he said. "German Shepherd sable coat, amber eyes. If he responds like you're saying, he's been trained in scent detection or protection. Dogs like that don't forget their work. They carry it with them." When Nolan hung up, he sat in silence. A shiver of respect moved through him. Brody wasn't just a survivor of a storm. He was a soldier in his own right, scarred but steady, carrying loyalty in every step. That night, Nolan told Lucy. She sat cross-legged on the rug, Brody's head heavy in her lap. Her eyes widened as Nolan explained. "He's special, Lucy. He's been trained, maybe even served in the military. He knows how to protect, how to guard. That's why he found his way to us. He's not here by chance." Lucy bent over Brody, her arms wrapping tight around his neck. Tears slid down her cheeks, but her voice was firm. "He's our protector. He chose us." Nolan swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking deep. Brody was more than proof of cruelty. He was living testimony to loyalty and sacrifice. In a town divided by power and fear, the shepherd stood as a reminder that true strength came from service, not control. The realization spread quickly. Word reached Sheriff Marcus, then the townsfolk. Some scoffed, dismissing it as story-making. But others whispered with awe. The Carter girl's dog was a soldier once. The idea took root, and Brody's presence became symbolic. Where Calvin Ward's influence relied on silence, Brody embodied vigilance. Still, not all welcomed him. At the next school meeting, murmurs filled the room. Some parents argued a trained dog had no place near children. Others insisted Brody was dangerous, his scars proof of violence. The school board announced a hearing, a formal review to decide whether Brody could remain at Havenwood School with Lucy. When Nolan broke the news at home, Lucy straightened her hand firm on Brody's back. "They'll try to take him away," she said quietly. Her voice no longer trembled. "But I won't let them." Nolan nodded, pride mixing with concern. "Then we'll stand together." The hearing was set for the following week. The town would gather witnesses, called evidence weighed. For the first time, Lucy would stand before the board before Calvin Ward and speak her truth with the weight of her own voice. As Brody lay stretched across the doorway that night, guarding her sleep, Nolan whispered into the quiet, "You're more than a dog, old boy. You're her shield." The auditorium smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, its stage draped with a plain blue curtain. Folding chairs filled the floor, and nearly everyone was taken. Havenwood had turned out in force, their voices low, restless. The matter on the agenda was simple. Should Brody be allowed to remain by Lucy's side at school, or should he be banned? But the air in the room told a different story. It wasn't only about a dog. It was about power, truth, and the kind of town Havenwood wanted to be. At the front, the school board members sat stiffly behind a long table. Principal Hensley kept her notes neat, her eyes scanning the crowd. Calvin Ward sat near the aisle, his suit crisp, his expression unreadable. Cameron slouched beside him, his jaw tight. When Nolan entered with Lucy and Brody, a hush spread through the room. Lucy's small hand gripped the leash, her back straight, though her eyes darted nervously across the sea of faces. Brody walked steady, head level, every step calm, as if he were trained for this moment. The board chair cleared his throat. We are here to consider a petition concerning the presence of a dog on school grounds. The matter will be addressed fairly with testimony heard from all sides. One parent stood, her voice sharp. That dog is dangerous. He has scars. Who knows what he's capable of? Our children shouldn't be at risk. Another rose, immediately shaking his head. That animal saved Lucy. He protects her. You've seen it yourself. Taking him away would be cruelty. The room filled with murmurs, voices rising, some for, some against. The board called for order. Then Principal Hensley spoke. We will hear from Abigail Carter. Lucy's heart pounded. She stepped forward, Brody moving close. Nolan gave her a nod from his seat, steady and calm. She drew a breath and faced the board. I was silent for a long time, she began. Her voice trembled at first, but then steadied, because silence kept me safe. At school, Cameron Ward hurt me. He called me names, mocked me, threw things. And when I brought Brody, he hurt him too. Gasps rippled through the room. Calvin's face tightened, but Lucy pressed on. She pulled the photos from her sketchbook, laying them on the table for the board to see. Grainy images of Cameron shoving his foot at Brody, tossing stones, smirking as the dog recoiled. These are real, she said firmly. I took them myself. Brody never fought back. He only protected me. That's why he has to stay. He's not dangerous. He's a soldier. He's my shield. Silence fell heavy. The board members leaned closer, their eyes scanning the photos. Parents whispered, some in shock, others in shame. For the first time, Lucy's words carried farther than her drawings. Calvin stood abruptly. This is outrageous. Manufactured nonsense from a girl too fragile to know truth from fear. My son will not be slandered. But Lucy lifted her chin, her eyes locked on him. It's not slander. It's the truth. And I won't be silent anymore. The weight of her voice filled the hall. Even those who doubted before sat still, their faces pale. The board chair spoke finally. This testimony cannot be ignored. The board will deliberate. But one thing is clear. This dog is not the threat. The threat lies in what has been hidden. Nolan's chest swelled with pride as Lucy returned to her seat, Brody pressing close. She had stood before the town and spoken without breaking. The auditorium buzzed with shock, the balance of power tilting. And though the hearing was meant only to decide a dog's fate, it had opened a deeper wound. The truth about the Wards was no longer whispers. It was spilling into the open. The auditorium still hummed with whispers when Lucy rose again. She hadn't planned to stand a second time, but something inside her pushed her forward. Her hands shook, yet her voice carried with surprising steadiness. There's more I have to say. The board members straightened, pens poised above their notepads. Calvin Ward froze in mid-motion, his polished calm beginning to crack. Lucy clutched her sketchbook against her chest. The night of the fire that took my parents? I was awake. I saw a car parked by the trees. It wasn't just any car. It had the Ward Company logo on the side. Gasps swept through the hall. Parents leaned toward one another, murmuring in disbelief. A few shook their heads, unwilling to accept what they had just heard. But Lucy pressed on her eyes, locked on Calvin. A man got out of the car. He carried a can. He went behind our house. Minutes later, the flames started. Her breath hitched, but she did not falter. I didn't understand everything then. But I do now. That night wasn't an accident. It was done on purpose. And the car belonged to the Wards. The boardroom fell utterly silent. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed to fade. Calvin stood slowly, his face pale, his voice cutting. This is slander. Dangerous lies from a traumatized child. You will not destroy my family's name with stories. But Sheriff Marcus, who had come quietly to observe, rose from his seat at the back. His voice was calm but firm. "I'll be taking this statement officially. Miss Carter has just provided eyewitness testimony connected to an unsolved arson. That means this is no longer school business. It's law enforcement." The room erupted in noise, shouts of disbelief, gasps of outrage. Some called Lucy brave. Others muttered that the Wards would never do such a thing. Nolan stood at her side, his hand steady on her shoulder, his voice low. "You're not alone anymore." Calvin's composure slipped, his jaw tightening. "You can't possibly," Marcus cut him off. "Save it for the courthouse ward. There's enough here to open a full investigation." Cameron shrank into his seat, his smirk gone, his eyes darting nervously toward the exits. Principal Hensley struck her gavel against the table. Her voice raised over the chaos. "Order, this meeting is adjourned. The matter of the dog is closed. He stays. As for the rest, it belongs to the law now." Lucy sank back into her chair. Brody's body pressed firm against her legs. She could feel his heartbeat steady as stone. For the first time in a long while, the weight on her chest eased. She had spoken the truth, and the truth had landed. By evening, word had spread across Havenwood. Headlines appeared on local news sites: "Girl accuses Calvin Ward of arson and parents' deaths." Neighbors gathered in clusters, voices sharp with speculation. Some clung to the belief that Calvin was untouchable. Others whispered that maybe finally the Wards would face justice. At home, Nolan stoked the fire while Lucy sat close to Brody, her pencil moving in slow, careful strokes. She drew not flames this time, but a gavel above a courthouse. And beside it, Brody, standing tall as if ready to walk through those doors with her. Nolan watched her pride swelling in his chest. He knew the storm was only beginning, but she had crossed the hardest threshold. She had spoken. The courthouse steps were crowded long before the trial began. Reporters gathered with cameras, townsfolk clustered in groups, voices low with anticipation. Havenwood had not seen a case this large in decades, and every eye turned toward the old stone building where judgment would soon fall. Inside the courtroom was solemn, the air tense. The judge presided from the bench, gavel resting heavy before him. At the front, Calvin Ward sat with his attorneys, his tailored suit sharp, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Cameron shifted uncomfortably, avoiding every gaze. On the other side, Nolan placed a steady hand on Lucy's shoulder as they entered. Brody padded beside them, his vest clean, his posture calm but alert. Murmurs rose immediately, some in awe, some in protest. The judge raised a hand. "The dog remains. He is part of this testimony." Lucy clutched her sketchbook close, her breath shallow. Brody's steady presence pressed against her leg, anchoring her. She drew strength from his quiet loyalty. The prosecution began with financial records. A series of ledgers appeared on the screen, numbers stark under the courtroom lights. Funds were diverted from Ward Industries, the prosecutor said. Payments to shell accounts coincide with the night of the Carter fire. Purchases of accelerants and materials are unaccounted for in the company's books. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Nolan watched Calvin closely. The man's jaw twitched, his hands gripping the table tighter than his calm expression betrayed. Then came the witnesses. Employees of Ward Industries, voices wavering but firm. One after another, they described being ordered to falsify records, to park vehicles in certain places, to remain silent under threat of losing their jobs. Each story added weight threads weaving together into a net too tight for Calvin to slip through. Finally, the prosecutor called Lucy Carter. The room grew still. Nolan squeezed her shoulder once before she rose. Brody moved with her, his body pressed close as they walked to the stand. The judge nodded, allowing the dog to remain at her side, behind. Lucy sat, her small hands folded around her sketchbook. Her voice trembled at first. That night, I saw a car with the ward logo. I saw a man carry a can behind our house. Minutes later, the fire started. Her words cut through the silence, clear and sharp. She opened her sketchbook, showing the drawings she had made. The car, the shadowed figure, the flames. Then she placed the photos of Cameron's cruelty on the table. They say silence is weakness, but silence kept me alive. Now I speak because the truth matters. The judge leaned forward, his expression solemn. The gallery stirred with murmurs. For a moment, even Calvin's attorneys seemed shaken. Calvin rose suddenly, his voice booming. Lies, all of it. You think I would risk everything for some land? This is a witch hunt, but his words rang hollow. The evidence lay heavy on the table, the testimonies stacked against him. Sheriff Marcus stood near the back arms, crossed eyes steady on Calvin. The judge raised his gavel. Order. The wood struck once echoing. This court will recess until final judgment tomorrow. But let it be known, truth has been laid bare today. As Lucy stepped down, Brody pressed his head against her hand. Nolan met her eyes with quiet pride. She had carried her voice into the heart of the storm, and it had held strong. Outside, the crowd buzzed, divided, but shaken. The trial had peeled away the mask Calvin Ward had worn for years. His empire of silence was cracking. The next morning, the courthouse brimmed with tension. Sunlight slanted through tall windows, cutting bright lines across the polished wood. The benches filled quickly. Neighbors, reporters, old friends, and bitter rivals all pressed close to witness what would unfold. Calvin Ward sat at the defense table, his face pale but rigid eyes flicking from the judge to the jury box. Cameron slumped beside him, shoulders hunched, avoiding every glance. Nolan, Lucy, and Brody took their seats across the aisle. Brody lay at Lucy's feet, his head raised, amber eyes unblinking. The judge entered the gavel, striking once. Court is now in session. The matter before us is the verdict in the case of the state versus Calvin Ward. The jury foreman rose, a sheet of paper trembling slightly in his hands. The silence in the room deepened. We, the jury, find the defendant, Calvin Ward. His voice steadied. Guilty of arson. Guilty of manslaughter. Guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud and unlawful seizure of land. The words hit like thunder. Gasps swept the courtroom. Some people clutched their mouths, others whispered in disbelief. Nolan's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the man who had hidden behind wealth and fear for so long. Calvin shot to his feet, shouting, "This is corruption, a sham trial. I built this town." His voice broke under the weight of the gavel pounding down. Order, the judge barked. The verdict stands. Calvin Ward, you will serve a life sentence without parole. The room erupted. Some cheered, some cried, some sat stunned. Years of whispers had finally reached their end. Lucy rose slowly, Brody steady beside her. She turned toward the gallery, her voice clear and strong. Today truth has won. My parents' voices were taken and mine was hidden. But silence was never the end. It was waiting for this moment. And now justice speaks for them. Her words carried through the hall, echoing against the stone walls. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed, but the crowd was hushed, hanging on every syllable. Brody pressed close to her side tail, brushing gently against her skirt, as if sealing the declaration with his own quiet vow. Nolan's eyes burned with pride. He had watched her rise from silence step by step until she stood here, steady and unshaken. The judge nodded solemnly. Let it be recorded, justice has been served. When the gavel fell, the final time, the gallery broke into applause, shouts rising like a wave. Havenwood had waited years for this crack in the Ward empire, and now it had come. Neighbors embraced, tears shining. The town itself seemed to breathe again, free from the shadow of Calvin's grip. As they stepped out onto the courthouse steps, Lucy's words still rang in the air. Reporters surged forward, but Nolan shielded her, guiding her through the crowd. Brody walked tall, his vest bright against the morning sun, his presence commanding respect. People pressed forward, some whispering, others openly cheering. "That girl is brave," someone said. "That dog? He's a hero." Lucy kept her hand on Brody's fur, her sketchbook clutched in the other. She knew the journey was not over. But for the first time, she felt the weight lift. Justice had not just been promised, it had been carried out. The courthouse steps emptied slowly, but the echoes of Lucy's words lingered across Havenwood. For days afterward, townsfolk carried her name on their lips. Shopkeepers told the story over counters, neighbors recounted it at fences, and children pointed whenever Lucy and Brody walked down the street together. To the people of Havenwood, the girl who had once lived in silence had become a symbol of courage. And by her side, the scarred German shepherd was no longer just a stray. He was the guardian who had stood firm when shadows closed in. Nolan felt the shift most in the quiet moments. At night, when Lucy curled on the sofa with Brody pressed close, he no longer saw the ghost of a child hiding behind drawings. He saw a daughter. And every time she lifted her eyes to him, steady and certain, he felt the echo of the promise he had once made to her father. One evening, after the trial's noise had begun to fade, Nolan invited Sheriff Marcus as a witness and placed a stack of papers on the kitchen table. Lucy sat across from him, pencil in hand. Brody sprawled at her feet. "Lucy," Nolan said gently, his voice catching, "I want to make this official. I promised your father I'd look after you, but it's more than a promise now. You are family. I'd like to adopt you, if that's what you want." For a moment, the room held stillness. Lucy's eyes filled her throat tight, but she nodded hard. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking into something stronger. "I want that." Nolan's hand trembled as he signed the papers, Marcus adding his signature as witness. When the last stroke of ink dried, a weight lifted. What had begun as duty had become love, and now it was sealed in the eyes of the law. Brody thumped his tail against the floor as if in agreement. News of the adoption spread quickly. Within days, Havenwood gathered at the community hall for a small ceremony. Lanterns hung across the rafters, the scent of baked bread filled the air, and neighbors brought flowers, cards, and warm embraces. Lucy stood at the front with Nolan and Brody beside her. A local pastor offered a few words, but it was the townspeople who gave the moment its heart. They spoke of resilience, of loyalty, of finding light after fire. When Lucy finally raised her voice to thank them, the crowd fell silent, listening as if every word was a gift. "This town gave me back my voice," she said. "And Brody gave me courage. Nolan gave me a home. Together, we found family again." The hall erupted in applause. Some wept. Others cheered, all united by the strength of her truth. Afterward, as dusk settled over Havenwood, lanterns glowed along the main street. Lucy and Nolan walked side by side, Brody leading with his head high. Children ran ahead carrying sparklers, their laughter carrying into the night. Nolan glanced down at Lucy, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. "You've changed this town," he said softly. Lucy shook her head, a faint smile curving her lips. "We changed it. All three of us." Brody barked once, sharp and sure, as if sealing the thought. But even in celebration, Nolan sensed Lucy's heart reaching towards something more. It was not enough to heal only themselves. Others still lived in silence, children carrying scars unseen. That night, as the lanterns flickered, an idea began to take shape. A place where silence could break, where children and dogs like Brody could find new beginnings. Spring came to Havenwood with soft breezes and trees bursting into green. The trial was behind them. The shadows of the ward name fading into history. But Lucy and Nolan knew their journey was not only about survival, it was about building something lasting from the ashes. The idea grew slowly, then all at once. Lucy had drawn it first. A wide house with open doors, children playing in the yard, dogs resting nearby. She had written a name across the top in bold, careful letters, the Haven of Voices. Nolan stared at the sketch, pride tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're serious about this," he said. Lucy nodded. "There are others like me. Children who think silence is the only way to stay safe. And dogs like Brody, who carry scars but still want to give. We could help them together." With Nolan's guidance and the town's support plans became reality. Volunteers offered lumber, paint, and labor. Marcus pulled strings at the county office to secure permits. The old church on the hill, long abandoned, was donated to their cause. Its cracked windows were replaced. Its walls repainted, its grounds cleared until it stood proud once more. On the day of the opening, the townspeople gathered again. Banners stretched across the yard, children held balloons, and Brody stood at Lucy's side wearing his vest polished and neat. The sign above the entrance read, clearly, "The Haven of Voices." Lucy stepped forward, her heart pounding, but steady. This place, she told the crowd, is for every child who has carried silence, for every soul who thought their voice was lost. And it's for the dogs who remind us that loyalty and love can heal even the deepest wounds. Here no one is alone. The applause that followed was not thunderous, but warm, a wave of support that wrapped around her like a blanket. Parents nodded, children clapped, and even the skeptical found themselves moved by the girl who had once spoken only in whispers. Inside, the rooms were filled with light. Mats and pillows lined corners where children could sit with therapy dogs. Shelves of art supplies stood ready, sketchbooks, waiting to catch words that had not yet found a voice. Lucy walked through it all with Nolan and Brody, her chest swelling with quiet joy. She paused by a window looking out at the horizon, where the sun dipped low, casting the world in shades of gold and rose. Brody leaned against her leg, Nolan standing just behind. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the peace that had been so far from reach only months before. Nolan rested a hand on her shoulder. "You've given this town more than justice. You've given it hope." Lucy turned her face toward him, her eyes shining. "We did it together." As the sun sank deeper, lanterns flickered to life across the yard, echoing the night of their small celebration weeks ago. Children laughed, dogs barked softly, and for once the sounds of Havenwood were free of fear. Lucy knelt, wrapping her arms around Brody's neck. She whispered into his fur words, carried by the fading light. "We are family, and our voices will never be silenced again." The German shepherd pressed closer, his steady presence sealing her vow. Nolan looked out across the yard, the haven alive with possibility, and felt the weight of his promise fulfilled. The shadows that had once defined them were gone. In their place stood light courage and the unshakable bond of a girl, a man, and a dog who had built a new beginning. And as the last light of the day faded into evening, the Haven of Voices stood tall against the horizon, a beacon for all who sought healing, and a reminder that even the quietest voices could change the world. The story of Lucy, Nolan, and Brody is more than a tale of loss and justice. It is a reminder of the healing power of loyalty, courage, and love. Out of the silence of grief, a young girl found her voice. Out of the storm, a battered German shepherd found a home. Together they rebuilt not only their own lives, but also the spirit of an entire town. German shepherds have long been known as guardians, loyal, intelligent, and deeply connected to those they protect. Brody embodies that truth. His scars did not define him. His resilience did. Through his steady presence, Lucy discovered that even the deepest wounds can be softened by trust, that even silence can give way to strength when met with unwavering companionship. The journey they shared carries lessons beyond Havenwood. It speaks to the importance of compassion, for animals who wait patiently for second chances, and for children who carry burdens they cannot always express. It reminds us that healing often comes in unexpected forms. A hand reaching down a paw, pressing back a moment of quiet connection that changes everything. The haven of voices born from Lucy's dream stands as a symbol of what can grow from pain. It calls us to build spaces of safety where the voiceless are heard and where every bond, no matter how small, is honored. At its heart, this story is not just about survival. It is about the triumph of kindness over cruelty, hope over despair, and truth over silence. It is about recognizing the silent heroes that walk beside us. Dogs like Brody, who remind us that love once given freely can ignite courage strong enough to change the world.